Welcome to the Designing Hollywood podcast in association with the John Campea Show. I am your host, Robert Meyer Burnett. This episode is sponsored by Fox Studios Costumes. Today's guest is an Academy Award-winning costume designer who works across genres and has brought her skills to more than 60 diverse film and television projects. Her deep understanding of character, combined with her nuanced use of color and texture, has made her an essential storyteller, committed to sharing the past, present, and future of Black culture. Born in Springfield, Massachusetts, she attended Hampton University, graduating with a bachelor's degree in theater arts. Initially, she pursued acting, but her work in the college wardrobe department led her to discover the art of costume design. Carter apprenticed at the Santa Fe Opera before relocating to Los Angeles, where she designed costumes for stage productions and dance studios. In 1988, Spike Lee recruited her to design the costumes for his film School Days. She has since worked with Lee on 14 films and has designed for many other directors, including Ryan Coogler, Lee Daniels, John Singleton, and Steven Spielberg. The same year, she was honored by the Costume Designers Guild with a Career Achievement Award and by the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, who awarded her the Academy Award for Best Costume Design. She brings vibrancy, nuance, color, and texture to each of her culture-shifting characters, transforming Oprah Winfrey into voting rights activist Annie Lee Cooper, Denzel Washington into Malcolm X, and Chadwick Boseman into the King of Wakanda. Without further ado, it is my great pleasure to welcome back Academy Award winner, costume designer Ruth Carter to the Designing Hollywood Show. Ruth, welcome back to the show, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me back.
I have to tell you, I think the first time I became aware of you as a costume designer, where I actually had to seek out who did these costumes, was when I saw Do the Right Thing. I was floored by that film. I saw it opening night. I'd already been a Spike Lee fan because I was a college student in Seattle in, 86? And I think I went to the Seattle Film Festival and I saw She's Gotta Have It. And I'm like, this is not in my wheelhouse, but whoever made this movie is someone to watch. I love the film so much. I love the way it was shot. I love the performances. And I'm like, this guy, I will see everything he ever makes. And of course, the second feature was School Days, which I loved very much. But when I saw Do the Right Thing, the design of the film, Ernest Dickerson's photography, the color, but what you did with the costumes, the way you defined character, you knew exactly who those characters were from the time Rosie Perez was dancing in multiple outfits in the opening credits to everyone in the film. And I was just blown away. I mean, I imagine that you and Ernest Dickerson and the production designer would sit around and discuss how you were going to, what colors you were going to put in each scene and put on each. I mean, it was the use of color and design in that film was unbelievable. And I was just blown away. So,
well, thank you very much. I really appreciate you expressing that. I'm honored that it stands the test of time as well. It's in the National Library of Congress, and I've even viewed it at universities where I was a guest speaker and sat in the audience and watched it from start to finish and enjoyed it. It does really stand the test of time in many ways.
It was just recently re-released on 4K Blu-ray disc, so it's at the highest possible quality. And
Yes.
The one thing about it I would say is I wish we heeded the messages that are in that film. I mean, years later, it's as prophetic now as it ever was, if not more so.
Yes, it is. And those issues were present, I feel that we did a stylized version of Brooklyn's Bed-Stuy because we wanted to present not only a diaspora that we all knew that we weren't seeing in cinema, but also it was a protest film. And so it was important for us to give it character and give it a strong color, sense of saturation and color. And also it was done like an independent film. It was, it didn't have all of the money that it needed. So we had to go with product placement from Nike that, became obvious. But also for me as a costume designer, I had to balance all of the color, the saturation color with African fabrics that are also very vibrant, and combining that with the product placement that we received from Nike actually did, balance out very nicely, but it also stylized the film.
Mm.
And if you look past the block that we created for Do the Right Thing into the real Bed-Stuy, there was color. You did see color. You saw, people walking the streets with, colorful shorts and T-shirts, and it was summer and hot. But we actually, took it a step higher.
Yeah.
And because we were telling a story that took place in one day, the hottest day of the summer in New York City, so we wanted to project a sense of the heat.
Oh, and I mean, it comes across in every frame.
Awesome.
Now, hearing that you wanted to become an actress when you, from a younger age, I wonder if you could tell us about, like, what movies were you watching growing up? Were you a film fan, and what were some of your big influences?
Oh, when I was a young girl, my mom would take me to New York to Broadway.
Mm.
So I saw The Wiz with my mom. I saw the color, not Colored Purple, but For Colored Girls. I saw that on Broadway, and we would go on church trips on a bus. And I grew up in Massachusetts. That was about 2 hours from New York City. So it was not uncommon for there to be a bus trip to Broadway to see a play. And so I was introduced to theater that way.
Was Broadway more influential for you than motion pictures?
It was. I wanted to work for the Negro Ensemble Company when I heard about A Soldier's Story, and I really did not see myself in film until I went to see The Color Purple. And when I sat in the movie theater, I was working in live theater here in Los Angeles. I went to see The Colored Purple, a screening of it, and I was just mesmerized by the storytelling, by the cinematography, by the beautiful costumes. I was, very much in love with period theater work. And I'd done quite a bit of it for theater as an intern at different theater companies. Even when I was in college, we did A Raisin in the Sun, we did Moliere, we did Shakespeare. So I knew how to research and, delineate the periods. So that was my passion at the time. And watching The Color Purple was Aggie Rogers. I was the costume designer on it. I really wanted to see myself as a costume designer in that world of film.
Plus, you ended up working with basically the entire cast of Color Purple.
Yeah.
Which is,
Yeah.
I adored the film. I saw it probably 5 times in the theater, and I loved Quincy Jones's score.
Oh, yeah, it was fantastic. I mean, I still watch it and get excited.
I was a huge Margaret Avery fan too.
Margaret Avery, yeah. Adolph Caesar was great performances in The Color Purple as well. Akusua Busea and Whoopi Goldberg, just magic.
Incredible. Now, one of the things I think is very cool about your early career is not only people talk about how the independent film with Tarantino and Kevin Smith and Steven Soderbergh became big in the early 90s, but predating that was people like Spike Lee and Robert Townsend and the black filmmakers that sort of were the precursor in that indie world. And because you worked on things like 5 Heartbeats, and the first superhero movie of the 90s, which is Meteor Man, and you were right there as this burgeoning these black filmmakers were, and all these actors were all coming together and did some incredible work in all different kinds of genres. You worked with one of my favorite actresses, Angela Bassett, who is ageless, and I don't think she's ever looked better than she does in well, I haven't seen Wakanda Forever yet, but my God, do your costumes, the way you dressed her in that movie, oh, I can't get enough of Angela Bassett. What was that like in those days with that explosion of Black filmmakers and talent making films in all genres and even Keenan Ivory Wayans doing I'm Gonna Get You Sucker.
Yeah.
What was that
You know,
like?
well, there are these, I think placeholders in Black filmmaking. There's Oscar Michaud, there's Marvin Van Peebles, and then you get Spike Lee and Robert Townsend. You go through these eras that redefine what Black filmmaking is. And one of the things that's consistent is they want to tell the story their way. They want to see the images that they see. And that's what our purpose was, or our intent was, in the late 80s, early 90s, when I actually bounced back and forth between the filmmakers every year. I averaged 2.5 films a year.
Yeah.
I'd do a Spike Lee film. I'd come to LA. I'd do something with Robert Townsend or Keenan Ivory Wayans. And they basically shared me because there weren't many of us that were African American in costume design doing independent films. Now, I had friends that were working on the original Coming to America, and they were doing work as costumers, and they had aspirations of being designers, but they were actually working in the studio system. I was not. I was working in the independent world and creating, my own way of doing things, which worked for me. And so I was like a lone wolf, and so that's where I cut my teeth. And so for 10 or 12 years, I bounced back and forth between New York and LA, making 2 movies a year.
Yeah, and then it wasn't just that. Then you throw something in the mix like A Cobb, which
Yeah.
was, I mean, that Tommy Lee Jones, man, what a performance there. So you were doing all kinds. You even worked on, well, that was later, but you worked on Serenity. You did Joss Whedon's adaptation of his own TV series, Firefly. So your filmography really does span the gamut of historical, futuristic, now with Afrofuturism, with the Black Panther films. I mean, it's an incredible array of stuff that you've done, and
Thank you.
I'm so impressed by your filmography. And the funny thing is I've seen so many of these movies, and even Spike Lee's films. There's such a wide variety. Like I remember seeing Summer of Sam too. I was knocked out by Summer of Sam.
Yeah, that was great to do with Adrian Brody and. Yeah,
were you in New York? Were you do you remember that? Are you too young to remember that?
In 77, I was in Massachusetts. I was in 77, I was 17.
Wow.
And yeah, so I remember hearing about it, but I was far away, and so I didn't really have the effects of, the scare. But making that film was amazing. Bouncing between like classic 70s, disco 70s,
right,
and then punk. And so there were some dressing rooms that I, went in with a pocket full of safety pins and a pair of scissors, and just went to ripping and pinning and creating. So I've been very fortunate that I do have those films. I think after I was nominated for Malcolm X, Hollywood began to take notice, and I got those interviews with like Ron Shelton and Joss Whedon.
Yeah.
And also very creative directors. Joss actually was in many of my fittings, and not actually being pushy, being more supportive and creative and funny, really funny guy. So I had a little coaching, into the Hollywood system.
Sure. I mean, one of the things I also love is that a lot of your work, you did things from I'm Gonna Get You Sucker all the way up to My Name is Dolomite Is My Name, harking back to the early 70s, that whole era. Like you mentioned, Melvin Van Peebles and like Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song. But
Right.
the entire early 70s, I mean, I was a huge fan of Fred Williamson, Richard Roundtree. I mean, you got to do the John Singleton's remake of, or not remake, continuation of Shaft, and celebrating. Were you a fan of that era? I guess the blaxploitation era of the early 70s, all of those films?
I was a big fan, that was my teenage years, and everybody flocked to the movie theaters when you were teens. And, we were looking at everything from Bruce Lee to Barnabas Collins to
Right.
Black exploitation. I mean, that was the thing to do on the weekend. And
William Marshall is
with,
Blackula.
yes, yes. And we go to this local movie theater that I probably cost hardly anything to get in. And we would watch these movies and The Spook Who Sat by the Door. I mean, all of that. It didn't feel like blaxploitation then. We know what it was now because
Right.
we know like the details of it all. But then it was just a wild ride, through urban legend, through urban storytelling, and to be able to recreate my teenage years and do all the things that I remember, like Nick shirts and high waist polyester pants and marshmallow shoes, and the whole trend of that era. I just on Dolomite remember being in the van heading to set, and then seeing all the background, dressed and hanging outside and waiting to go into the set, and feeling like, wow, we have just transcended into the 70s.
Man, I mean, I know that's later, but Dolomite is my name. You nailed it. I can only imagine how much fun that movie must have been to make.
Yeah, I had
Because
a very, very strong crew on that. Haley Stupel and just really strong crew, Dana Hart. And we carefully crafted that because I wanted it to feel authentic.
oh, it was, and that movie was so much fun to watch. It was
Mhm.
just what a great film.
And Dolomite even was bigger than how we portrayed Eddie Murphy. He was even bigger than that.
Oh yeah,
So there was a matching of his outfits, many of those hysterical scenes.
it was great. I mean, it was funny because when home video became big in the early 80s, I don't know how I stumbled across the Dolomite movies and the Human Tornado, and
Oh yeah,
I had never seen them before, and they were terrible copies, but my friends and I would watch them incessantly
yeah,
because you couldn't.
hysterical.
They were hard to get. Like you
Hmm.
couldn't, and I couldn't. Later on, Warner Brothers would release things like Coffee, and I met Larry Cohen, who had made Black Caesar, and
Yeah, I
I
remember
just
that.
became a huge fan of that entire era of filmmaking because, like you said, it was so
Right.
gonzo, and people were making what they wanted to make.
Yeah, it was a time of independent film too, as well. So Dolomite was an independent filmmaker. He financed the whole thing himself.
Absolutely. And I really thought that movie did justice to him, to Rudy Ray Moore.
Yeah,
And I thought it was very respectful as well.
it
And
was.
and
It
and that
was.
can-do spirit was infectious in that movie.
It was about him as a filmmaker and a comedian,
Yeah.
which is where we kept it.
And it was hard to get his records, but they were out there.
Yeah,
You could
yeah.
find them. Now, what was it like finally to work? You mentioned how much you like Color Purple. You finally got to work with Steven Spielberg on Amistad,
Yeah,
which is an unbelievable film.
right. I just remember walking into his office, into a conference room, and he handing me the script and telling me to go home and read it and let him know if I'd like to work with him. And I thought I could go into the parking lot and read the script and call him from the parking lot, but I did go home and read it. And Steve Zalian was the script writer, and I felt like it was like one of those turnkey moments, one of those times in my career where I was going to work with one of the best filmmakers in Hollywood, and I was excited and up for the challenge. And I remember gathering a lot of my art history books and getting more because the photography was in its infant stage, and I had to rely on the masters, the paintings, to kind of guide me with a color palette and see some details of Africans during that time. And it was just a real wonderful research project as well. Debbie Allen was the producer who called me when they decided to give me the job, and I was excited about being connected with her too, as a sisterhood. So, but it was tough to do. We were like a traveling circus. We went from Los Angeles to Mystic, Connecticut to Boston. we were all over the place. And that was a really, really big film for me.
Yeah, and again, Debbie Allen. I was a fan of hers since I saw her in Alan Parker's Fame. As one of
Yeah.
that film is it still holds up 42 years later. It's an incredible movie, and she's great in it. And a huge fan of hers. And it was interesting to watch her transition into producing.
I know. It was wonderful working with her too.
And now I have to ask you, of course, about your relationship with Spike Lee, which has been so fruitful. And how did you begin? Had you seen She's Gotta Have It? And how did you begin working with him on School Days?
Well, I was working in South Central Los Angeles in a little dance studio, doing the costumes for a dance troupe. And he came to see the show. A friend of mine from college, Robbie Reed, brought him to see A Night for Dancing. And we all were about the same age. We all hung out afterwards, going to a local dance club. And Spike was very insistent on talking with me about how to get film experience, but I really loved the theater. So I was not really connecting to, this guy who was a filmmaker who hadn't really shown She's Gotta Have It out, in the theaters yet.
Sure.
Telling me to go to USC or UCLA to the films department and sign up to work on a student thesis project, and how I'd be on a set, I'd see all the equipment. It would just be like, a real film. It is a real film. And he kept in touch with me. He'd send me a series of postcards that would have still images of She's Gotta Have It. And, inviting me to see a screening, letting me know when he was in town. And I was working in the theater long hours. I was down at Los Angeles Theater Center. I became the shop foreman for a very short time. I was an assistant costume designer most of the time, working at under 5 theaters under one roof. And so I was busy.
Yeah.
And even at night, sometimes running the shows. And, that was my life. And I really didn't have time to really go to screenings. It wasn't my thing. But I finally did. And once I saw She's Gotta Have It, and it was a girl walking through Brooklyn and, having 3 boyfriends. And I was like, I've just done the English Cat at Santa Fe Opera. I have, just did Vanya's 3 Sisters at Los Angeles Theater Center. I mean, I think I can do that. And so I went over to USC and I signed up to do a student thesis project. And before I knew it, I was on a set out in a remote location where there were a lot of orange trees. And I was hearing, quiet on the set for the first time. But there were 2 people sitting on a porch swing having a conversation. And I couldn't even hear them. I couldn't hear them. And so I was talking when they said, rolling. I didn't know that you weren't supposed to talk. So I was learning. And shortly after that, one morning, Spike called me and said, this is the man of your dreams. And I thought, Denzel? And he was like, no, this is Spike. And I'm going to do School Days. And I want you to be the costume designer.
Wow.
And that was like, I don't know, say it was the month of January. And so I quit my job. I immediately started drawing all the characters in the script. I drew every character. And I didn't actually go on payroll until June.
Wow.
I don't know how I survived. I know I went to my brother's studio in New Hampshire. He's a fine artist, and he had a studio, and I would sit at his big, huge, jolly table, and I would draw all those characters. And as time passed, I went to Brooklyn with this ginormous portfolio my brother loaned me. I flew in from Boston to LaGuardia, and Spike gave me instructions on how to take the train. I didn't know you could take the train to LaGuardia, and he gave me directions on how to get to his place on the subway. And I was like, sure, like, yeah. And I remember just trying to navigate that big portfolio through those turnstiles. And I finally got to his little basement apartment in Brooklyn, New York, and I laid out all these sketches. There were easy 50 sketches, and my brother had said, make sure if he likes any of them that he signs them in the corner, and there you'll have a record. So I asked him to sign them in the corner,
Your
and
brother was
so
smart.
he did. Yeah, he did, and then we all got together and went to a screening of Native Son that night. And I remember feeling like I was beginning my journey in the film, into the film business, into the filmmaker's world. And it was exciting and adventurous. I remember feeling that. And Spike gave me a pair of Converse. They were sparkly Converse, and they were a little bit too big, but I wore them to the screening anyway, because Spike was really into, tennis shoes. So you had to have so that was his gift to me, that, this pair of Converse.
I love that. I mean, what were some of just to ask you, the differences between theater and film? What were some of the differences that became readily apparent to you as you started this journey into the world of cinema?
Yes, well, coming out of theater, you do make things a little larger than life because there's an aesthetic distance. There are things that disappear with the distance, and so I had, I loved painting on fabrics, and you could do a lot of tricks of the eye from the stage to the audience, and I really enjoyed that. I enjoyed being larger than life, and School Days was the first film I did, and it had a theatrical quality
It did.
to it, so I was lucky in that I could transition.
School Days was probably a perfect jumping off point for you to get into film because it did have a theatricality to it.
It did, and but also I was learning about filmmaking and how we, as part of 40 Acres and a Mule, Spike's company, we would review dailies all together. We would go into a theater to review the film, and I could see how something that might have worked in theater was not working in film. I could actually see and learn how to pull it back and be more subtle. And one of my favorite examples of that is in the film Casino, where Ray Liotta is telling the babysitter who he's engaging to be a mule and to run some drugs.
Oh, you mean in Goodfellas?
Goodfellas, yes, in Goodfellas. Thank you. And the girl is on the phone talking to her mother after Ray Liotta tells her, don't use the phone. She uses the phone anyway. And when you see her fingers, her nail polish is so chipped and it's black. And, she just has this character of this rebel, non-listener, kind of babysitter chick. And the subtlety of that chipped nail polish just impacted me, that I could actually create so many more layers than I could in theater with film.
Yeah, well, what a great specific example that is as well. Now, you also went on to work with people like Ernest Dickerson, who was a cinematographer, and then you later work with him as a director.
Yes.
And, I think one of the things I saw, again, I go back to Do the Right Thing, was you guys had to have developed, what is it like for you to work with a director of photography and a production designer in terms of developing color palettes? And again, I thought that was very apparent actually it was apparent in School Days as well, but how you really create character through color. And how does that work with you? And how does your relationship with the director of photography and the production designer work?
I feel that the director of photography gives me some guidance in terms of him being afraid or not afraid. I used to do a lot of tests, color tests, white tests. I would put several a range of white in front of the camera during camera tests, so I could see how bright I wanted the whites to be. And so there was always this conversation between myself and the DP about colors, and the use of white. And Spike would do a lot of experimentation. We did bleach bypass processes
Mm.
and things like that, where we were exploring how a film and color affect each other. And so there was that dual kind of learning going on with films like Clockers. And once Ernest went out and directed Surviving the Game, I was the costume designer, and it was a wilderness story. And so we were a film family. So it was kind of like a no-brainer that if I was available and Ernest Dickerson branched off to direct a film, that he would take me along. Um, and so I got to really explore all kinds of palettes, all kinds of color palettes through our director of photography. And that was exciting. And Spike worked with other DPs as well that I would, actually learn from. So that part was amazing. And then Wynn Thomas and, as you know, Hannah Beekler from Black Panther also um, were part of the collaboration of the use of color. Um, Wynn uses color in his sets, and he was always bringing color samples, paint samples, wood samples, surface samples to my office so that I would have something to work from. And Hannah as well, unafraid to use color in their stories. Brown skin looks great with vibrant colors. Oranges and yellows look beautiful against brown skin. So we had to figure out a way to use color. And in a way, in the late 80s, early 90s, that wasn't being used. I mean, most of the palettes were considered, high filmmaking were grays and browns and neutrals. And there was this theory of keeping people in a neutral zone so that the story is the most important thing. And yet we were doing Do the Right Thing, or we were doing Mo Better Blues,
Oh,
or we couldn't be neutral and tell those stories. And also, because of the melanin, we were using color to bounce against the skin. Wesley Snipes, a beautiful dark man, couldn't wear gray and black, and we were putting him in pumpkin and cranberry and bouncing that color against his skin, and it actually added to his complexion in a beautiful way. And same with the Dora Milaje.
yeah. I mean, it's interesting that you say that because, like, Mo Better Blues, as a jazz fan myself, and I grew up. My dad introduced me to Miles Davis. I was a huge jazz fan. But that film, the color palette of the costumes, and it's
Yeah.
interesting to hear. I mean, there's actually a practical example for that as well, which you just defined, and that's something I think that not a lot of people think about.
Yeah.
I did a story about a year ago about how there was not enough makeup artists in Hollywood who can deal with people of color,
Mm,
hair and makeup people, and that we needed more of them. And
yeah.
I approached it from the perspective of from a producing standpoint, that you really need to understand that your hair and makeup people, and to a certain extent costume people as well, are your first line of defense with your actors, because they need to know
Mm,
that they look great. They can't think
yeah.
about how they look when they walk out in front of the camera. They have to already know that they embody the character. So you have to get people that understand how to do hair and makeup and costume for various skin tones or whomever. And that's an art form that is frequently overlooked, especially at the independent level. But
Yes, and one of the formulas that I think is common when people are new to defining what colors people can wear is to look at hair color, eye color. Are their eyes blue and their hair blonde? Are their eyes brown and their hair brunette? Are their eyes green and their hair auburn? Then you are they a ginger? You have a very clear, defined path to some of the colors that will look best on them. But when you get a brown skin person, you have brown eyes and brown hair and brown skin. So now you need to understand what undertones are, what their undertones dictate, and how you can enhance. Army green looks great sometimes on certain brown skin. So you do need to understand whether they have red undertones or yellow undertones in order to select color.
Well, this goes back to, a lot of the costume designers I've talked to have had a rigorous academic background. They spent a long time either studying art history or things like what you're saying now is so specific about understanding how color actually works.
Yeah.
Did you learn those things on the job, or were those things that you were brought from color theory or art history or things like that? Or was that just
Well,
practical experience for you?
a little bit of all of that. I grew up with artists in my family. My older brother was a fine artist, and we revered him. He had small exhibitions around town, mainly like in the mezzanine at our local movie theater. My brother's oil paintings would be on display there, and we were very proud of him, and we revered, his artistic talent. And I grew up with art. My other brother and I, who are closer in age, we utilized my brother's sketch pads and crayons and chalks and paints and acrylics and oils. I actually knew how to mix oils like really young, which was probably like not a good thing, but my brother was an oil painter, so his stuff was around.
What
And mhm.
So you really learned, you got practical experience from an early age because of your family and your brother. That was amazing
Yeah,
to have that.
color mixing and blending and things like that was not a strange world for me. It wasn't necessarily that I knew about complexion, but my brothers were also portrait artists, so they drew and painted brown skinned people. And so getting into the film industry was exciting to me, and I wanted to understand color theory really badly and studied on my own a lot, um, whatever it was,
Well,
whether it was color balance on stage or the right colors to put on people.
it's so great then that you started out with Spike doing School Days and Do the Right Thing and then Mo Better Blues, because the use of color in the costumes in those films was astonishing. I don't know if you
Oh,
weren't there that you would have had the same result. Spike was lucky to have
hey,
you. He pursued you for a
hey,
reason.
he did. Well, he comes from an artistic background. His father is a jazz bassist, rest in peace, a jazz bassist. Oh, he's still alive. So Spike's father was a jazz bassist, and so he came from a jazz background. He appreciates art. He was a collector, or is a collector, and was from the start. So I walked into a world that embraced production value.
Mm. Well, that's amazing. So it's amazing that you had that background to bring with you. And I think it shows. It shows immediately with your film work right out of the gate, it's just incredible. And you really carried that through all of your work. I mean, as I look through your entire filmography, you really
Mhm.
did a great use. And now I suppose I could talk to you forever, but I do want to address what you do have coming out, which I know literally the planet Earth is waiting to see, which is Wakanda Forever. And again, the use of, I mean, I know that Marvel, it seems like everybody works with Marvel. They all talk about, yes, there's a visual design department that starts these things before anybody comes to work on them. But
Yeah.
your work on Black Panther first
Mhm.
was the use of color and fabric.
Uh-huh.
Everybody looked just fantastic in that film. I mean,
Mhm.
just the look of it
Mhm.
all. was unbelievable. And while
Mhm.
you've talked about it before, so I don't want to be redundant because I want to ask about Wakanda Forever. But
Mhm.
when you went into Wakanda Forever,
Mhm.
obviously we had everyone, I mean, you knew Chad Boseman, and
Mhm.
the man was a warrior, and he faced the end of his life. I mean, one of his last performances in Ma Rainey's Black Bottom was ferocious. I
Mhm.
can't imagine what it was like to have lost him. And
Mhm.
we all, an artist that had such a great life, but up until the very end, he never stopped giving his all. I mean,
Yeah.
from Get On Up to Wakanda Forever to Mo Rainey's Black Bottom and everything he did in between, the guy was an incredible actor.
Yeah.
But I can't imagine, what was it like to then have to go back and do Wakanda Forever. I can't imagine that could have been an easy thing to do.
Well, no, it wasn't. And anytime you do a film that large, it's never easy, even in the best of circumstances. And we had the worst of circumstances. We lost our beloved Chadwick. It's still very difficult for me to talk about that time without getting emotional. We did this film in the middle of COVID.
Yeah.
We were Zoom calling each other. We weren't hugging each other, embracing each other when we suffered that loss. But I think the circumstances surrounding having to muscle through a pandemic and um, and repair from a great loss, mourn, be a family collectively, uh, became a part of the passion of the journey to create something that not only you would be proud of, that he would be proud of. And
Mm.
that's, probably what the intent was, the purpose was for all of us when we thought about how to enhance the film. And, just to, go through the process a little bit, Marvel does have a visual development department. Um, you, I'm a part of that. My team is a part of that. It's not separate from the costume design process. We analyze, we look at everything together. We throw out suggestions. It's a very open forum. It's a very collaborative medium. Wakanda Forever is so huge.
Yeah.
It is not. It is not the brainchild of one individual artist. It's the collective. And once these images are decided on, whether they're mine or Meinerding, his team, my team, we're all the same team. And we gather them and then we create them. And that process also involves a design element, which is choosing fabrics and
Yeah.
colors, machines and surface textures and beads. And it goes on for weeks and weeks. And in the end, you have created something that's not 2D, it's 3D. And there's a design element to 3D. There's a person involved, there's an actor involved.
Mm.
And so this process is massive. And no one person can say, like in that game show To Tell the Truth,
Right.
there's no one person standing. Our leader is Ryan Coogler, and he's the final say. He's the final decision maker at many stages of the process. And he's very adept at explaining what he wants. So we're all on a mission to create this beautiful tableau that we can all say tells one story, and our storyteller is the writer and director.
Absolutely.
So I love that we can work together, and I think that's what makes these films look as good as they do.
Oh,
Because
absolutely.
if I wanted to put a grasshopper in the middle of the scene, it may not happen. So,
Well, one of the again, what I loved about your work in the first Black Panther was it was such a logical extension of your entire career in terms of the way you use color to define character and the way you used fabric that held the colors. Now,
mm,
one of the things that I've been looking at and seeing for Wakanda Forever, which I'm dying to see, is not only you created Wakanda as a living, breathing nation state. Every costume told a story, not just
mhm,
with the character on screen, but about like M'Baku's his realm,
yeah,
and the Dora Milaje, the way they had trained and the way they moved and everything. But now with
yeah,
Wakanda Forever, you had to create a whole new nation state. You had to
mhm,
create the Talakan Empire, which,
mhm,
again, rather than going to something like you've got the whole African history and then the future
mhm,
Afrofuturism, you had to go
mhm.
back to an entirely different culture.
Yes.
What was that like for you?
Well, as I said, we all pitch in with ideas and we work very closely with historians and we have access to them at any time. I had a very strong ACD crew that continued to pose the questions
Mm,
to the historians, that they were excited to inform us that one thing might have been Aztec instead of Mayan. They helped us understand that we were being inspired by the Mayan, the Mesoamerican culture and post-classic times, and that how would this underwater world exist with their cousins above ground?
right,
And the elements of the sea, what would they use to live, and would they clothe themselves? I mean, we worked with free divers that had to move and breathe underwater, and so it was very challenging to come up with the look that embodied not only a very ancient culture, and to honor it, but also use the elements of the ocean. So we looked at fish and coral and kelp, and we used that as our fabric story to how they would honor the fallen fish with the bones, or
right.
how they would mimic the fins of a beautiful lionfish. And at that point, I had to decide, where we would go and have these things made. And fortunately, I was able to work with some of the most talented artisans in the world,
Right.
to create the Tola Keneals, to create the new Black Panther costume, to create the Dora Milaje's upgraded armor. I worked locally, I worked internationally, and everyone had their task. So, through hundreds of Zoom calls and videos and samples that were sent to me, we were able to compartmentalize everything and get it done.
Were there, because color has been so important to you and in your work, were there, did you look at the Talakans as having an entirely different color palette that you could use? So when you had the Wakandans on screen with people from the Talakan civilization, that they would bounce off each other and contrast on screen? Was that something you were consciously trying to do?
Well, when you look at the Dresden Kodak, you kind of get a sense of the Mayan culture. When you look at the pottery, you get a sense of the pageantry. When you read about the elements that they use, the spondylus shells, when you look at the wapiles and vegetable dyes and things that they might have used, the color palette does come alive.
Right.
And the way you combine it, very different than African culture. And also because we were in the ocean, so we had kelp, we also had to come up with our form of vibranium, and that was, on something that was undersea, and we were able to do a series of resin molds and We presented greens and blues, and there was a process of putting metallic flakes in the resin to have a glitter effect that we did in layers to present. And all of this was presented on Zoom to Marvel and to Ryan Coogler. And then we found what we considered was the Tolkien jade, which was a beautiful blue jade. And from there, we use a lot of that and a lot of gold. So we wanted to explore the pageantry of the Mesoamerican culture, but not the Aztec, because the Aztec was a much bigger civilization than the small community of Mayans that we were inspired by.
Sure. Well, it's amazing. I mean, I cannot wait to see this movie. I mean,
I can't wait either.
It's we're less than a month away. Well, listen, I know that we had an hour and we have to wrap up, and I appreciate your time, and sorry we had some technical difficulties, but
No worries.
I think to end, obviously we want somebody to tell us what advice can you offer to people now that might want to follow in your footsteps? Where should somebody begin? What should they concentrate on in terms of moving into this kind of profession?
Well, it's very complicated to answer that question today. I used to say that get into independent film. Go to, like Spike's advice, go to the schools and sign up to work on an independent film. But now the independent filmmakers get to choose from a list of professional costume designers.
Right.
I think that if you feel that you're a costume designer, you have to do that wherever you can. And, if it means that maybe you are a costumer, you are an intern, you are a PA, but you're also a costume designer. So, don't forget to pursue your dream. Don't get caught up in something that you don't feel fulfills you completely. If you have to do a one-woman show or theater project, make sure you exercise that muscle of visual storytelling. And eventually, I think if you're persistent, you will be a costume designer and you will win an Oscar.
And congratulations on that, by the way, after nominations to finally win one for such a great project as well.
Yeah, it really was.
Now,
Thank you.
Can people find you on social media?
Yeah, I'm the real Ruth E. Carter, and that's pretty much it. I try to minimize the amount of social media. I used to be on Twitter and have a Facebook, and I dropped some of those things because I didn't want to get caught up. I just do Instagram. That's it.
Well, listen, Ruth
That's
Carter,
enough.
that's it. It is enough. Instagram is fine. I can't tell you how much I enjoyed speaking with you today. And thanks for coming back on to the Designing Hollywood podcast. And again, I think the entire planet Earth is waiting to see Wakanda Forever. I hope it is the smashing success that it looks to be, because it looks incredible. And fingers crossed, I really wanted to see Ruth Carter dressed vampires. So I'm hoping Blade gets back up and running, because I can't. I know I can't talk to you about Blade because I would geek out. But Ruth Carter vampires, I don't know how you're gonna dress them, but
I'm up for it.
I can't wait to see what you do with the Daywalker.
Yes, thank you. Looking forward to finishing it up myself.
Well, thanks very much for your time, and I very much appreciate coming back on the Designing Hollywood podcast.
All right. Thank you for having me, and I appreciate this platform.
Well, thank you so much. A very special thanks to our incredible guest, Ruth Carter. Thank you to our sponsor, Fox Studios Costumes.
Fox Costumes is located on the west side of Los Angeles on the historic Fox lot. We offer an extensive and unique array of costumes and textiles from modern and contemporary to vintage and historical. Since its reestablishment, Fox Costumes has grown its inventory, particularly its fantasy and sci-fi costumes. Since early 2019, we here at Fox have been implementing a new costume identification system that uses radio frequency tags. These RFID tags make it much easier to locate, track, and identify each item in our inventory. which is now available to be seen and rented straight from our website, foxcostumes.com. Now you can order any of our available costumes and we will ship to you wherever you are. Fox Costumes also offers the following services: alterations and made-to-order, fabrics, fitting rooms, wash and dye facilities, office, and prep cages. Fox Costumes helps to provide costumers and costume designers the opportunity to turn their ideas into works of art.
A special thank you to founder and executive producer Martika Ibarra, co-founder, costume designer, the legendary Marilyn Vance, and of course, John Campea from The John Campea Show. Thank you to all of our viewers for tuning in, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Tune in to the audio version wherever you listen to podcasts. I am, of course, your host, Robert Meyer Burnett, and you can find me on Instagram at rmburnett, or find me on Twitter at BurnettRM, or on YouTube at PostGeekSingularity. Thanks very much. Like, subscribe, and give us your comments. What would you like to see on the channel? Right down below. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you on the next episode of Designing Hollywood.